Hello, Nikki and Carew. Nikki, I just watched your most recent video, and you mentioned there's a whole bunch of things you mentioned. I actually took notes myself because I'm not bright enough to keep all that in my head. But I think I'm not going to respond to all of the specific things you talked about. But what I am going to do is real quickly make a video, little background information about Carew and my lives. And so I've created this infographic, which I will put up right now. Boom. There you go. You see it? So this represents my life and Carew's life roughly in 1 year, rounded off to 1 year time slices from 1986 to 2012. And you can see here that it's coded. I used color to represent the different locations where we've lived. And you can see because there's adjacency, which is a technique in visualization, information visualization. So you can see where and when Carew and I lived in the same location when the color is the same in adjacent cells on my timeline and Carew's timeline. I also put in a couple little additional pieces of information, like when we were married, which is represented by an M, and when we gave birth to, when our wives gave birth to children, I should say. Those are the C's. So as you can see, and some of these things, like they're not exact because it's rounded off to the nearest year. So let me real quick run through my timeline, and I'm going to try to run through Carew's too, even though I'm sure I'm going to mess it up. So as you can see, after graduating from high school, I did not go to school right away. I got a job at Arby's. Actually, I worked the summer. I don't know if you knew this. You knew this. I worked the summer in La Conner with Nancy Serves doing summer stock theater, and decided that even though I was accepted at Evergreen, I was probably going to flunk out if I went. So I got a job at Arby's and worked there for a year, and then got a job doing computer mapping. And Craig Daniels got me that job. He called me up one day and asked me if I was working, and so I went to work for Thurston Regional or Thurston Geographic Information Facility, and I worked there, and I ended up working for them and then Thurston Regional Planning Council doing computer mapping work for several years. And meanwhile, I went to actually, in order to get that job, I had to be a student, so I actually signed up for one class at the community college. And then I started attending community college full time because I got recruited by the soccer coach to play on the soccer team there. So I actually went to school for all the wrong reasons, but I ended up enjoying my time at South Puget Sound Community College, and by 1990 I had graduated with an associate's degree. So in 1990, Sarah was graduating from Bryn Mawr, and Sarah and I had kind of reconnected the summer before when Carew and I spent a summer driving around the United States. It must have been the summer of 1989, and Carew needed to shuttle a car to Florida where his parents had moved, and we decided that we were just going to take the summer off and drive around the country together. So we each had $500, and we drove from Olympia to Colorado, where I had friends. We stayed there, and then we went down through Arkansas, where we hit on a couple girls that he knew, and then we headed to Florida from there, and then up the East Coast, where we visited friends on the East Coast, including in Pennsylvania, where we stopped and saw Sarah, and she hit on me, and I had a girlfriend at the time, and I dumped my girlfriend and started corresponding with Sarah. Anyway, Sarah and I got married the following summer, and we moved to Auburn, Washington, which you see is the 1990 year we spent there. Then we moved to McCleary. Sarah got pregnant immediately after we were married, as you may or may not remember, and we had Bryn 11 months after we were married, and then Carew 2 years later, a little less than 2 years later, and we lived in McCleary, Washington that whole time. Sarah was in grad school at that time, working on her PhD, and we went to Belize for her to do her PhD research. During that time, actually, I went to school at Evergreen briefly, and then took some classes on the side while I was working full-time for Thurston Regional Planning Council to pay for having children. And then when we went to Belize, I actually worked out an independent learning contract and finished my bachelor's degree in 1994 while we were in Belize. And we were actually in Belize from the last 3 months of 93 through 1994, at which time we came back and we moved in with Beth and Carew. Now, meanwhile, Carew had gotten married to, so Carew met Beth at our wedding, and then he hit on a bunch of different women and settled on Beth, and so Carew, after the first year Sarah and I were married, he was finishing up school at in Ellensburg. He spent 5 years in Ellensburg. He has his bachelor's degree in English literature, and then was signed up for a year abroad in Soviet Georgia. He went to, or former Soviet Georgia. I don't know, actually, was it Soviet? I don't know. I can't remember exactly how this works out in Carew. We'll fill you in. But anyway, he went over there for a while. It was a pretty short time. I don't know if it was like 6 weeks or something. But there was a huge revolution in Georgia, and he ended up having to come back soon. And so he came back and went to Winona, Minnesota, where Beth was, and they were engaged to be married at that time, and then they got married, I believe it was 1991, summer of 1991, the year after Sarah and I were married. And then they moved to Pullman, Washington at some point in there. So they moved to Pullman. We went to Belize. When we came back from Belize, we moved to Pullman, and we actually moved in with Beth and Carew, and we lived with them for like 9 months before our wives decided that it was better if we lived in separate spaces. And so then Sarah and I got a duplex, and we lived there, and I worked for the Nez Perce tribe doing GIS work while I applied to grad schools. And then I visited grad schools, and actually I got in several places, and I got good funding, which was cool. And I looked at LSU, UNC Chapel Hill, and Penn State. And I got a full ride to LSU and decided not to go there because I didn't like the school. And Penn State, I got a partial fellowship and an assistantship. And so we ended up going to Penn State. We were there for 4.5 years. I spent 2 years, got my master's, and then they wanted me to do a PhD, and I decided I didn't want to do it, but my advisor offered me a research faculty position working in the GeoVista Center there. And so I worked for 2.5 years in the GeoVista Center, and since I was there, he recommended I work on the PhD program. So I actually was ABD on my PhD, meaning I'd done all my comprehensive exams and everything. And then I decided I was not happy with the grad school experience, so and I didn't want to finish. Well, actually, I got an offer from ESRI to go work for them, and I was tired of doing work that wasn't applied, so I decided to go ahead, and we moved to, and they paid to move us to Redlands, California. We ended up spending 1.5 years in Redlands, and I worked for ESRI on the software development team for the GIS software ArcMap. I don't know if you're familiar with it. Anyway, I got to ESRI. I hated it. Actually, that's not true. I got there, and 6 weeks after I got there, they actually hired me to lead a team to do information visualization, statistical visualization, and mapping. And I got there, and 6 weeks after I got there, they killed the project for various reasons. And so I was unhappy there because I didn't have a lot of purpose. And so we decided we wanted the best job I'd ever had, the one I enjoyed the most, was working for the Nez Perce tribe doing GIS work. So there happened to be a job online we saw at the Umatilla tribe. I applied for that and ended up getting it. Boom, we're in Pendleton, Oregon. Now through this whole time, we had Brennan Carew right off, and we were only going to have those 2 kids. That was the plan. But then Sarah, while we were living in Pullman, had this sort of life-altering kind of vision, and decided, just as she was finishing her PhD, that she really didn't want to be a professor, and she enjoyed staying home with her kids. And we had friends who were homeschooled, and she decided she wanted to homeschool and have more kids. And so I was like, okay, I don't care as long as you don't mind being poor. So, but I didn't want to have more kids, and it took her about a year to talk me into it. So we had Gareth my first year in grad school, and that was going to be our last kid. And then in shortly after we moved to Pendleton, we found out she was pregnant with Taryn, and so we had Taryn in 2004. So that's kind of the story of my life. And so I worked as a GIS program manager for the Umatilla tribe, and then I was promoted after about 3 years doing that they created a new IT department. Actually, I wrote the plan to do that, and so I've been the IT director since then. Boom, that's my story. I'm sticking to it. Carew, on the other hand, let me go back and see if I can get this right. So he and Beth got married. He applied to grad school in English literature at Washington State University. Came back, went to grad school at Wazoo, hated it, dropped out after less than a semester, I think. Got a job as a parking enforcement officer at Wazoo, and then they liked him so much that they asked him to go into the police officer program. So he became a Wazoo campus cop. After a short amount of time doing that, he moved on to being a City of Pullman police officer, where he did all kinds of really cool stuff. He was he became a community liaison officer, I believe. He'll correct me on this. And then he became a campus liaison officer, and he worked actually up on Greek Row and won some awards doing that, and only got beat up occasionally. And so then he actually made sergeant, was promoted to sergeant, and over that period of time, he and Beth had 4 kids, 4 boys in Pullman, but Carew found that he was unhappy doing police work. It was soul crushing, and so he decided that he wanted to get out of that and started working with Beth's parents, Beth's dad in particular, on opening this coffee shop thing. So eventually they left Pullman right about the time, just a few months actually, I think, before we ended up moving back to Pendleton. And they went to Winona, where he worked on a business plan for a year to open the coffee shop, and wrote the whole thing up. And actually, one of the things important about when they were in Pullman was that they bought this old house for like $50,000, and Carew threw his life into fixing up this house, and he learned all of these skills. You're talking about his home improvement skills. He learned all these skills, taught himself, worked with my brother-in-law Brad actually on this a lot, and basically rebuilt this house on his own with some help from some friends. And then actually ended up working part-time at a building supply place as well when he was a cop, because he didn't have enough to do. And you know, really did a great job rebuilding this house. So then, anyway, so he had his four boys. They moved to Winona. They had then Colleen, their girl, shortly after they moved to Winona. I don't remember if it was about a year after you guys moved. I don't know. And opened the coffee shop with Keith, and has been since working on the coffee shop like a fiend and living in Winona, Minnesota. So as you can see by this timeline that I've created, there was a lot of variability in the first few years. Carew's been a little bit more stable than I have, moved around a lot, but the last 10 years we've both been pretty stable. And actually it'll be 10 years for me living in Pendleton. This August will be the 10-year anniversary of us living in Pendleton. And I think Sarah and I lived the first 15 years of our marriage. We lived, or actually the first like 13 years of our marriage, we lived in like 15 different places. We moved all over the place. And then we've been in this same house since we pretty much, well, we moved once since we've been in Pendleton. So that's the background. That's almost 15 minutes. It's probably maybe a little boring for you, but you now have a nutshell of the life that Carew and I have lived, and how it has intersected. So in the last few years, Carew and I actually we reached a point where we were stable enough and had enough money where we could actually visit one another, because we went for long periods without seeing each other through this. Especially when I think I saw Carew one time when we were living in Pennsylvania and California. So over that 6-year period, but yeah. Anyway, probably more information than you wanted, Nikki, but still dead.